Hello and welcome back to another episode of Filthy Hope. If it's your first time here on this podcast, we spend time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life and culture intersect. I'm your host, Pastor Jonty, and today we're going to be hearing an interview that I did a little while ago with the Rev Will Nicholas, also known as Rev. You may be familiar with him by that name. A while back on the podcast, Rev Ness and I were talking about this idea of apocalypse. And apocalyptic literature, and Rev got in touch with me and said he'd love to come on the show and talk all about apocalyptic literature and the idea of apocalypse and how we can look at theology through the lens of fiction, and in particular science fiction and fantasy. So we had a really, really awesome conversation. It went in a lot of different directions. We're going to jump straight over. We won't leave you waiting. And I will talk to you on the other side. Here's my interview with Will Nicholas, aka Rev. Alrighty, well, joining me on the podcast, we have a very special guest, Reverend Will Nicholas. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Jonty. It's great to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. Maybe just for our listeners who don't know who you are, give us the pitch deck. Give us the brief introduction to Rev Will Nicholas.
I was born in New South Wales, so I'm from where you guys are and where a lot of people who listen to you would be. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and have always had a real strong interest in theology and science fiction, even at school. I had a bit of a reputation for being the person not to start a conversation with about theology or about science fiction if you didn't want to be hanging around for a really long time. So it's been a bit of an obsession of mine for a long time. Studied horticulture at university, and got really tired of manicuring lawns for wealthy people who didn't care about them. And so decided to use my horticulture to go on mission to the Solomon Islands as part of the Uniting Church's People in Mission program, and had an absolutely fantastic year over in the Solomon Islands, working on micro-loan projects for sustainable agriculture. And part of the time over there, obviously very theological and spiritual country. Got very involved in a lot of Bible studies and theology, and even did some chaplaincy at one of the theological colleges there, which led me to decide to come back and candidate for ministry and become a minister of the Uniting Church. Since then, I've been a youth worker at Albion Park Uniting Church on the south coast of New South Wales, near Shell Harbour. And did university chaplaincy at Wollongong Uni. Was then at Chatswood South Uniting Church, doing work with the Courtyard Cafe. From there, did a couple of IIM, intentional interim ministry spots with a couple of churches, and with Ku-ring-gai and Sydney North Presbytery. And then went on to Knox Grammar School, and then after that went to Tasmania, and now I'm in Geelong. So that's kind of been my journey. Father of three boys. Two of them grown up, left home, one of them in year 9. And my wife Amanda is also a minister and has had her own amazing journey through placements in different spots. So yeah, that's the nutshell.
Yeah, wow. You've been everywhere.
Yeah.
And when were you at Knox? Because for people that listen to the show, they'll probably know that I was at Knox Grammar for a couple of years.
So
I had no idea.
I was a chaplain at Knox with Phil Newton. I don't know if you know Phil, but Phil and I started at Knox together. So that would have been 2008. 2008, and I was there for 4 years, so to 2012. So that was my time period. Spent it was in the time of Richard Lebroy, who you've had on the podcast, and I remember Richard fondly. Richard was one of my chapel captains, and we did some amazing stuff together, especially working in the area of cadets, because cadets is a really intense experience for students at at private schools, and we did a lot of work in terms of creating a pastoral care network and even a pastoral care team in the cadet unit at Knox. So yeah, it was a really, really amazing time.
Yeah, well, there you go. That was a bit before my time. I won't say exactly when I was there, but it was after that. I you can dispute this if you'd like, but someone told me a story, and I'd be curious to hear what you think. That you were
Nice.
in your time doing youth ministry, did an interview in which you asked, "How are you going to feel about youth kids potentially breaking things?" And when they said that they would be okay with it, you got up and broke something. Is there any truth to this?
Oh, I love this story. It comes back every now and then. It's in the interview process, we talked about what the costs or consequences would be with having a youth ministry, and that particular placement, it was an elderly congregation. They had a beautiful sandstone building and some of the most magnificent stained glass I've ever seen. And so, as an example of what the consequences would be, I spoke about what it might be like to actually have that broken. There was some renovations being done at the time, and I picked up a hammer that was sitting in the room we're having the interview with, and I made a motion as if to break a window, but it's apocryphal that the window was actually broken. Um, but even just the suggestion that we would do that, the fiction that such an apocalyptic thing could actually happen, was enough to actually kind of set the tone for where we were going, and to give us I think, some fairly broad ranging and wide permission to actually explore what we were prepared to actually lay down if we wanted to be engaged in a ministry, especially with young people.
Mm, mm. It's funny, almost on the flip side of that. I also spent a few years in my first placement was in youth ministry, and I remember getting an email um, come across mine and the minister's inbox one morning that one of the tables, the white trestle tables that I think every church across every universe has a bunch of, had been broken, and the assumption was that the youth group kids had been dancing on the tables, and we need to tell the youth group kids to stop breaking stuff. And our response, of course, was, "What do you think we do at youth group? What, like, we didn't break the table." But there was just this like immediate assumption that, like, oh, the youth group kids break stuff, which I guess I wear as a
Yeah.
bit of a badge of honor as well. But
And
it is
even
what
if
it is.
it's true, like this wear and tear, and that's part of, I think, what we'll get onto a bit later on, but this whole idea of how fragile theology can be, how fragile church
Mm,
is a really important thing we need to be able to work through and confront, because if we keep it in a box wrapped in plastic all the time, and we never get it out and play with it, then we can be sure that it will always stay in pristine condition.
mm.
But as Buzz Lightyear was reminded by Woody in Toy Story, he's a toy and he's meant to be played with, and my view of theology is the same. I think that we need to get it out and play with it. We need to get our churches out and play with them, and
Mm.
things are going to get broken.
Yeah, I love that. Um, so before we get into some of the science fiction and apocalypse stuff, so heads up, we're going to be talking about this idea of apocalypse and what that means, and what science fiction and speculative fiction uh, might have to say to us in the fields of theology. Before we go there, I'd be curious to hear about one of the last things you said in your overall brief. Led to, I'm assuming, what you're doing now with Odd Sonder. Could you tell us about what that is, and maybe the journey there, and what that's looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently placed in a little suburban church in the rural city of Geelong, which is about, for those who are not familiar with Victoria, although anyone who went to, I think, NCYC, what was it, 95? Was it 90? No, 95 was Adelaide. NCYC, National Christian Youth Convention, was in Geelong. And it's about an hour and a half on the freeway southwest of Melbourne. So we're kind of outside. There's a big gap of fields between the city of Melbourne and the city of Geelong, and so I'm there in this placement, which is actually directly across the road from the Geelong College, which is a Uniting Church school. and we've been experimenting with broadcasting, digital ministry, and looking at a whole range of things. And it was part of the placement. The minister before me was thinking about that before, and so it was one of the things that attracted me to come to Geelong to Newtown in the first place. Was that they were already open to the idea, even though many of them, being older, didn't really understand how technology would work. And so I started playing around with this idea of what it would be like for us to be able to create a digital community online. And at one synod, I was there, and I was having a chat with Kelly Skilton, and Kelly is currently our digital synod worker, looking at especially digital ministry and youth work in Vic Tas Synod. We said, well, we're not going to know unless we just try something. So we just sort of let's work out, let's play with all the platforms, let's start broadcasting. And so from that, the stuff that I was working on, Neveroddoreven, and a series of podcasts around that, and Sonder Collective, which is what Kelly was working on, came together to become this thing called Odd Sonder. For those who aren't as familiar online, my online handle is Odd Rev. I'm that everywhere I go, and actually it's now starting to leak out into my real life. So there are actually people who run into me and go, "Hey, Odd Rev, how you doing?" So the Odd and the Sonder came together. So as part of the Sonderverse, which is what we're calling it now. So our community meets from all over the place, from Geelong to Traralgon to Canberra to Canada. We've even had people from New Jersey and other places join in, and we range from people who are 13 to 73. I think this is the oldest person we've had. The good thing about Twitch, which is where we run it, and you can look that up, you can find it on Sonderverse Twitch online, is that all you need to do is click on one hyperlink and you're in. And you can choose if you want to sign up. You can sign up, and then you've got a whole lot of other options. You can chat and talk and be involved, but you can see it just by clicking on a link, which is great on Twitch. And we have faith discussion nights. We explore ways of being community as digital beings. We have a lot of deconstruction and reconstruction. And we just play. We play in the space of theology in the digital space. And throughout the week, we gather and also have games on Board Games Arena, Jackbox. We've got a Minecraft group. We even ran a program called Zombie Church, which is actually in using the 7 Days to Die Steam set up by Fun Pimps, and so we basically can get as many people as we want into one server. And the idea came up because a couple of us were playing 7 Days to Die one time, and we came across this old abandoned church, and they said, one of the people said, "Imagine if we did that. Imagine if we, you know." Reconstructed it, and so we decided we'd do that, and people gathered around it, and we had the most amazing theological conversations. Every time I go to the zombie church now, it reminds me of that scene in The Walking Dead. I don't know if you've seen The Walking Dead, but
I haven't. No.
In The Walking Dead, they're kind of moving across this apocalyptic landscape, and they're dodging zombies, and then they hear this bell in the distance, and so they go towards it, and they find this old church which is surrounded by overgrown stuff, and each and every one of the main characters then engages with that church in a way that kind of has a different reflective nature of their faith. So every time we come across it, we're playing online and we go to the church, and we're doing something to it, or a horde of zombies comes to try and tear it down, then we engage with that. So yeah, Odd Sonder happens every Monday night, 8 o'clock. Anyone can come, everyone's welcome, and anything can happen.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, shamelessly plug that I went on, it was about a month ago, probably 2 months ago, by the time this one comes out, and had a great time. So, I've definitely tuned in a couple of times since, and yeah, it's just really, I think, and there's so many parallels between the streams that you guys are doing and what Ness and I, not only in what we're doing, but what led to us trying to do it. Like, I think there's so many parallels there, and it's just really awesome to see that, like, what for both of us and the groups that we're doing it with, it's not something that we're just trying to do in isolation. There's a real need and desire for people to connect in a meaningful, faith-based way in online spaces.
Yep.
So I just think it's awesome to see, and wish you all the best with as that continues to grow.
Well, thank you. Yeah, look, we really enjoy it. There's been a couple of times, as with anything you do, where we've got to sort of, both Kelly and I have got to about, and our producer. So we actually have a producer behind the scenes who actually, does all of the heavy lifting for us in terms of changing scenes. We don't have to do all of that kind of stuff. A lot of Twitch streamers, they're doing everything themselves and they'll use a stream deck or something.
Yeah.
I've got one of those, but having a producer is just so good because we just have to think about looking at it and catering to our community that's gathered. But there are times Kelly and I will get in touch with each other, at sort of 7 or an hour before, and we'll say, look, I'm not up for this tonight. I just don't feel like it. I'm exhausted. And we'll go, look, let's just start it up, see what happens. And it's actually energizing. And that's a surprising thing for me to say because I'm an introvert and I don't normally find output energizing. But there's just something about the I don't know, the energy of it that just means that I've just got to get started, and there it is. The community carries us as much as we carry them. So
yeah, I definitely find that, like, we'll sit down to record a podcast as well and be like, I just do not feel like doing this today, but we'll sit down, turn the cameras on, see what happens, and it's like you're reading back my own thoughts, because I'm also a massive introvert, do not find output particularly energizing most of the time. I reach my limit and have to go and retreat and recharge, but the podcasts somehow do the opposite for me.
And I think, what makes it different from regular preaching, like, I'm up in the pulpit every Sunday morning, and I do find that really exhausts, especially if it's kind of that's not giving anything back. But there's a sense in when you're doing a podcast or you're actually engaged in a live stream and you've got people they're putting back into you and you're getting that kind of feedback and exchange, which actually is very appealing for an introvert, because there's a sense in which it's going both ways. Whereas when it's very outputty, it's very exhausting. So I long for a church, and I love that I have a church on a Monday night, where it's actually an exchange rather than a lecture or a one-sided thing. So I really want to challenge churches to say, how can we be different? How can we find a model that actually allows us to be a place of exchange, a real Areopagus like you'd find in Acts, rather than just I guess a presentation or a lecture.
Yeah, I love that. And people that are watching may have figured out already that you might be a little bit interested in science fiction. Just I've spotted a couple of titles that I know behind your head. Maybe how did you first discover science fiction? Was it through literature? Was it through movies? And what drew you in initially?
Oh, look, it has to go back to Doctor Who for me. I'm a massive Whovian. I started watching Doctor Who under my grandmother's table, surrounded by pillows and blankets. We used to build a blanket fort. I must have been no more than 5 or 6 years of age, watching. And at that stage, that was the tail end of John Pertwee before the third Doctor, before Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor, took over. So I'm a massive Whovian. But it wasn't long after that that 1977 rolled around, and as a very small boy, I was taken off by my mum and my dad to go and see Star Wars. So it's been that strong media, kind of movie episodal part to, but when I got a bit older, I discovered that I'm dyslexic, which is why I have the rose-colored glasses. It also helps me see the world in a better way. But I discovered that whilst I couldn't write really well and I was having trouble with math and doing other things, one thing I knew I could do was read. And I could read really quickly. So I kind of do this dyslexic pattern recognition thing where I can actually look at a page and just scan it and just know what's there. And I don't always remember it, but I'm actually and so I got on to science fiction writers like John Wyndham. I got right into Asimov and started reading fantasy like Tolkien, and Lewis, and so then things really stretched out then, because I was no longer dependent on the imagination of a cast and a director and a producer and all of those who might produce a movie, but I was actually able to do all of that inside my own head as well. And it wasn't long before I got dissatisfied with that, because in high school, in the 80s, the whole Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing game scene came on. And so then that meant that not only could I watch something, not only could I read and imagine something, but now I had the opportunity to influence, to engage with it directly, and to be able to be a part of, become an actor with agency in the story. So that's where role-playing, tabletop games, all of those things that actually allow us to not just, watch Dune or read Dune, but actually find ourselves immersed in that and make decisions that affect the outcome of the story. That just took it all to a whole new level.
Yeah, I resonate so deeply with that what you were talking about with reading and suddenly not being bound by what a cast or a director or a cinematographer has put on screen. I vividly remember, I mean, like a lot of people my age, Harry Potter was one of the first novels that I read. But when I was probably 10 or 11, I was handed Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the Philip K. Dick novel, which was adapted into Blade Runner, and hadn't seen the movie. So I was probably too young at that point. And it was that same thing of like all of a sudden being fed these words that, what do these words, like, how do you even picture what this page is trying to tell me? And all of a sudden your imagination just takes off.
Yep.
In a way that, like, obviously, like, I'm still a massive, like, I watch films religiously and read religiously as well. But I think reading science fiction, and I was really lucky. I got the opportunity to go to a selective primary school in years 5 and 6 where they fed me just like books that no 10 or 11-year-old should be reading, but just was fed that imaginative, speculative fiction style of writing that just took me to a whole other world, literally and figuratively. So
absolutely. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a book is better kind of guy. Like, that's, there are some people who'll do that. They'll get on board and they'll say, oh no, don't want to do that because the book. I really appreciate being able to see someone else's interpretation and being able to go, oh, okay, so that's how they saw it. And really appreciate that over time, we're actually able to reinterpret and retranslate what might have been well written in the past. So when you look at the presentation this year of Frank Herbert's Dune being redone and reset, there are things in that are actually from our time that actually now place a different lens on what was actually occurring. And so, yes, it is different to the book, but there's something really fascinatingly sociological about that as well. So to go, okay, so why is it different? Why did this person decide it was important to translate or to change or to transform it in this way, so that it actually would appeal to or inform or challenge an audience of today, in a way that it couldn't do back then. So I guess, I mean, that's my complexity, is that I and I've been told I'm a terrible movie and film and book critic because I just love everything. So that's my big flaw, and I try to steer away from being a critic, because I'm actually much more of a reflector. I'm a hermeneutic when it comes to those kinds of things.
Yeah, I definitely, like, as someone who dabbles in the film conversation criticism circle a little bit, I definitely I less and less am comfortable with saying I don't like something and calling it a quote unquote bad movie. It's more about, okay, what conversation does that bring out? And that's why I actually was thinking about this as you were talking. The difference between reading a novel, for example, and watching a film. I actually think are different experiences on such a fundamental level, in that when you're reading a novel, it is entirely internal. It's all happening in your head, and someone watching you read a novel, all they see is you literally just staring into space. It's all internal. Whereas the act of sitting down and watching a movie is innately social. You're interacting with the images and people on the screen, but also then with the people around you that you're watching it with. And so I think when we, like, exactly as you say, when we talk about adaptations, to say, oh, if we're going with the example of Dune, that of course there are things that are different in the movie and in all adaptations on screen of Dune to the novel, as opposed to saying, well, that's different to the book, so that's bad. What it's actually already done, without a lot of people potentially even realizing, is it's started a conversation amongst a group of people that otherwise may not have had a conversation at all, let
Yeah,
alone about
absolutely.
something as specific as, say, the Messiah complex or whatever it might be. Yeah, so
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, one of the things I've also realized is that when we're talking about, so we're talking about time and space when we're actually interacting with literature or movies, is when you've actually read a book, and it may have been 10, 15, in my case, 30 years ago. And I just did this recently. I just reread Raymond E. Feast's Magician, which was one of the books that I read in my late teens, and I really enjoyed it and I loved it. And when I read that book as a teenager, I found myself on the hero's journey with the main character, who was a person of the same kind of age and had similar kind of feelings about their place in society. But when I read it the next time, just recently, suddenly there were all these other characters that were kind of background in that main story that leapt out for me. And so the time and space we read actually has a profound effect on how we'll actually encounter it as well. And so, of course, we'll have nostalgia, and our minds will automatically take us back to how we might have felt when we first read or watched or saw something. But the reread actually can also allow us to say, oh, look how different I am from when I was then, and what's shifted for me from this place to that place. So it's amazing thing to sort of spend time pondering on in terms of how these things affect us, not just in terms of space, but also in terms of time.
Yeah, I've definitely in recent months have been revisiting some films that I used to love when I was a lot younger, and it's that exact experience of you're experiencing the same film. It's the exact same collection of frames stuck together, but it affects you in such a different way.
When I heard your community revisiting a number of those Easter fictions that
Yeah.
we got to explore just recently, I went back and watched them over Easter myself because I was inspired to do that, and so the information I got from hearing your people talk about that, and then actually going, it then informed me looking at that. So there were particular things that I looked for that I wanted to engage with because I'd heard that. So listening to a podcast about a movie or a story or a book actually then allows us to encounter it in a new way, and we get to explore it in a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And even I find watching movies with other people, like I don't know if you've had the experience of there's a movie that you love and you want to show it to someone, and then you watch it watching an entirely different movie because you're watching it from the perspective of the person that you're showing it to. Like, oh gee,
Yep.
I wonder if they're enjoying this bit. Did they pick up on this thing that I really love? And all of a sudden, it takes on a whole other shape again.
I found a remarkable way to do that with my podcast. So my podcast, Neveroddoreven, is an intersection between faith and fiction. And I originally did it, first of all, because I was doing an assignment in communications and digital media at Deakin University just after I arrived here. And so I made the first 3 episodes, and I kind of went, wow, I love the fact that I can trick people into watching episodes of Star Trek and then telling me what they see, and they think they are engaged in an intellectual endeavor. And so I did a few more and a few more. I think I'm up over 200 now. So we've been covering Voyager. I've been doing Deep Space Nine. And with Voyager, I decided, because that was the second one that I decided to pick people to be on a consistent team regularly through. So Lindsay Cullen, who is the current acting General Secretary of the Assembly. It's nice to have a big name in my podcast, but and Elizabeth Rain, who's a really well learned and teacher of Old and New Testament theology, has worked at UTC. She's never watched any Voyager or Star Trek before, and so So sometimes Lindsay and I will nerd out and we'll go, oh, look at this and look at that. And then Elizabeth will actually kind of go, actually, I saw this. And so suddenly we're watching it from a different perspective. And I mean, Voyager and Deep Space Nine are my comfort food. So, when I'm absolutely burnt out, I go into a dark room, I put it on and I just let it cycle through on Netflix. And so I've watched these episodes hundreds of times. But I'm fascinated by the fact that I can get something entirely new just by sitting down with Elizabeth and Lindsay and actually going, okay, let's have an hour discussion about this particular episode.
For me, that's Twin Peaks, and which I guess is right on the edge of sort of fantasy and science fiction. And definitely, for me, I've seen all of those episodes of all the series and the movie like probably tens of times. And so watching it with someone who is entirely fresh to it and having conversations with them about it was just such a, like, not to use the word again, but such a refreshing experience of like, oh my goodness, I've seen this particular episode probably 30 times and I've never noticed this glaringly obvious thing, which then just makes me want to watch it all again.
To see how it fits with this other bit. Yeah,
exactly.
My other speculative fiction that I go to for that is West Wing. I'll just put West Wing on and I'll just let these conversations actually just go. I watch West Wing with my eyes closed because I don't need to see what's going on, and I've found myself actually, knowing the next line. You just speak out the next line and go, oh, and you get a bit of a buzz out of that because you kind of, it's like hanging out with an old friend.
Yeah. So a lot of people, and I've grown up and then gone to university and studied speculative fiction and studied the craft of writing and studied and spend my life thinking and talking about films and books, especially genre adjacent things, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or particularly horror. For me, it's not uncommon for people to ask, or at least want to have a conversation about, well, so why they just don't understand what there is to get out of, particularly science fiction and fantasy. It's not real. It's otherworldly. What can we, other than escapism, what is there to it? Is it all fluff? And I have really good answers to that question because I've spent, like you, my whole life like diving into and exploring these things. But I wonder for you, what's the meat and the substance behind speculative fiction? Is there, if you were to, and it's a huge question, I know, but like if you were to just try and take a scratch at it, what's the meat? What is there in science fiction that we can chew on?
I think the biggest thing, and I often get that same question from Christians, like, and sometimes it's kind of a like a veiled double-edged compliment kind of thing. So people would say, "Oh, you've got too much time on your hands. You obviously can spend your time wasting time playing games, reading fiction and engaging." The fascinating thing for me is that this whole divide that we've actually created in the last couple of 100 years between fiction and non-fiction, it's actually a relatively recent thing. And when we're reading ancient literature, we actually impose this, is it true question on it. So we're saying, is it fact? Is it fiction or non-fiction? But the bigger question for older literature is actually, what does it mean? Does it have meaning? Can it call us to something? And so when we look at Shakespeare, for example, we'll look at Romeo and Juliet and those other stories and we'll say, well, obviously they're made up, but they're amalgams of the society from which they came from. And so there's meaning to be gained. And Shakespeare wasn't actually asking the question, is it true? Is it real? And I actually think, and this might be controversial, but I actually think that we look at the Gospels and the Christian writings and religious writings in the same way. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the writers for their communities, they weren't interested in actually saying, is it true? Is it real? Is it fact? They were actually trying to write something that would actually create or generate or promote meaning for their communities. And so did it happen in this order? No. Did it happen in this way? But does this story and this story, when they're put next to each other, chapter and verse, I mean, some people even think that maybe when Mark was writing his gospel, he was going chapter 1, and then he wrote a sentence and then wrote verse 2. And no, those verses and chapters, they all came in later on so that people could reference and find them. They're not part of it. And it's fascinating to see what happens to that literature if you take all that out. Like, you suddenly have it, you could read it in a completely different way. The chapters and the verses, the divisions, the headings that have all been added to help us to navigate actually change the story in some ways. But for me, the big strength of speculative fiction is that it allows us as human beings to be able to tackle questions that are actually just too hard for us to be able to tackle in our real life, in the life happening around us. So I watch science fiction deal with issues on sexuality, on death, on betrayal, on murder, on things that are actually so difficult. And I think that's the appeal of horror, like we for those who actually are wanting to actually stare into the darkness just long enough to be able to see what meaning can be gleaned from there, you can do that without consequence. Now, of course, people who aren't wanting to do that have the consequence of nightmares and being very rattled by that. And absolutely, I'd never ask anybody to watch something that they didn't want to watch. But when there are questions that are too hard for us to face head on, we can actually look at them kind of sideways. We can kind of like see that there's a world there and actually look at it from the side, and that allows us to engage both internally and with others if we're watching together about something that is in this fictional world that's been created that actually has impact and meaning on the real world we live in.
And I think certainly my experience of that is stories and fiction allow us to allow those ideas and allow those themes and those things that, like you say, sometimes are too big, just too complex, too scary, too nebulous, perhaps, for us to interact with and confront in our lives. It's almost like it bypasses our first gate of rational thought, because it's presented in these archetypal images and stories that on some level, subconsciously, I think we are familiar with the language of stories.
Yep.
And so as opposed to sitting down and going, hey, Will, let's have a conversation about the nature of evil, right? That's a tough conversation for anyone to have.
Let's do that.
But also let's do that at some point. But it's a much easier sell to sit down in front of, say, a horror movie, or just think of how popular things like serial killer films and true crime podcasts and all of those sorts of things are. We know the vocabulary and language of stories in such a way that we can, in consuming these stories, we're subconsciously thinking about and processing these things that otherwise are probably too tough and big and scary for us to think about in any meaningful, rational way consciously. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but
look, so a writer, McAfee Brown, says that where we stand determines what we see, and I've always found that to be a fascinating statement, that where we stand and we make choices about where we stand so that we will see particular things. The thing is, though, that if I want to be able to see what it's like to actually be in the midst of an apocalypse and a fantasy apocalypse, or maybe I want to try and understand how a serial killer thinks and does things. So I'm watching Dexter Morgan in the series Dexter. Like it's actually not possible. It is possible, but it's probably not healthy for me to go and find a serial killer and actually say, hey, can I shadow you for a week and stand in that position to be able to get that. But Dexter Morgan allows me to actually take that journey and actually ask the questions about, in that series, we've got themes of redemption, we've got series of neurodiversity, we've got questions about family and how family structure works, about the nature of evil. All of those things coming up in that series actually allow us to explore those things without actually having to find a serial killer and look over their shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned this word apocalypse. Now's probably a good time to go there. Lots of people, and I spoke about this at the youth group I'm volunteering at the moment, because I was given the unenviable task of talking about the book of Revelation with a bunch of teenagers. Lots of people, when they hear this term apocalypse, they think of the end of the world. Whether it's recently The Last of Us on HBO gave us a post-apocalyptic vision of the world. People have this image of what the apocalypse might look like. This word apocalypse, when we are looking at scripture and looking at literature, actually means something not quite the same. I'm wondering, could you maybe explain for our listeners a little bit about this idea of apocalypse, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we get this word apocalypse from the Greek word apocalypsis, which is actually means revelation. It means to be revealed. And in fact, in the older Greek writings or translations of the book of Revelation, the book is actually called Apocalypsis. So we would more correctly translate that book to actually say this is a vision of the apocalypse. And so John of Patmos is having this vision. It's like he's watching a movie, and there are parts when you read Revelation, it's really fascinating. You have him say, "And then I saw, and then they took me to," and it's almost like there's this ancient man on this island, and somebody's brought a DVD player over and said, "Sit down and watch this." And so he's actually seeing it, and he's interpreting it from his worldview as being a vision. But this word revelation is fascinating when you mix it with apocalypse, because we do think apocalypse is the end of the world, and it is the end of the world, but it's the beginning of the world. So every Whovian actually experiences an apocalypse when it's time for their favorite beloved David Tennant to become Matt Smith. And so we're terrified by what might happen next, and we shed a tear when he says, "I don't want to go." And but then Matt Smith comes along, and we've got a new beginning, we've got a new possibility, we've got a new face. And so every apocalypse is an ending, and it reveals an opportunity for a beginning. And science fiction really provides us with, well, any speculative fiction provides us for that. I think one of the first times I ever played with the idea of speculative fiction and finding it in a biblical place is in the story of Nathan, the prophet Nathan, when he's given the task by God to actually go and confront the king who has just misbehaved in the most horrific way without consent, really rape we're talking about with Bathsheba. And so he's killed Bathsheba's husband to cover it up. So David has used his power to murder. And so we're talking about a man who's venerated as the greatest king ever, who's actually engaged in the misuse of power for both exploitation and for murder. Nathan's job is to go and say to this king, "You've done the wrong thing, and I know it, and you need to repent." Now, if I were Nathan and I was asked to do that, I would go, "Oh my gosh, why wouldn't he just kill me? Like, he's already done it once, he'll do it again." So Nathan cleverly comes up with a piece of speculative fiction. He goes to the king, and he says to the king, "Hey, there's this guy who had this really lovely lamb, and he loved the lamb. And his neighbor saw that he loved the lamb, and everybody knew that. And he took the lamb and he cooked it and he gave it to his friends for a dinner. And the king was outraged and said, 'This man must pay for his actions.' And then Nathan says to him, 'You're the man.' And so the speculative fiction convicts him, like you said, suspending his rational thought and his self-defense, his need to be able to make a safety for himself. And instead he reaches the point where he says, 'This is what must be done.' This is the meaning that comes out of this story. And so the king is then convicted by his own words, and he actually repents and moves to we can't fix the situation, but he moves to taking responsibility for the situation. And so in its deepest, purest form, science fiction is extraordinarily dangerous, because it actually can confront us and convict us of something that we would rather that would stay in darkness, that we would rather not talk about. And so I love it when we've had the opportunity, not only when it happens to me personally, but when communities are actually able to see that profound episode of Star Trek Next Generation, where they go to a planet and everyone is non-binary. And somebody in that non-binary planet wants to actually express a female gender. And so suddenly what we've got is an inversion of our own story about what's allowed in terms of sexual identity and what's not allowed. And we can find, and I've been with groups where we've actually found an outrage that this person should be allowed to express their true identity of who they are, because the gender is actually something we're used to. And then it's inverted back the other way to say, well, if that outrage exists for this, then should it not also exist for this? And so you end up with a very the opportunity for your worldview to be inverted in a way that actually changes where we stand and therefore changes what we see.
In some ways, that experience is apocalyptic.
It is
Revealing of a truth previously hidden in a way
Yep.
that can feel like the end of the world almost. I
It
remember
ends
having a
one
very
worldview. Yeah.
and ushers in another.
Yep.
I remember having a very, very similar conversation around that same topic with the film The Matrix,
Yep.
which for anyone that knows even the most surface level context about the siblings that directed that film in the late 90s, it's very obvious once you watch the film through that lens that it is a trans allegory. And having all of these feelings about identity and discovering oneself and stepping into the fullness of who you can be, having that then flipped to be a trans allegory, and having those same feelings still being true, but suddenly being confronted by them in a way that you were not comfortable with before is so powerful. And like you say, I think it can be dangerous, which to me, I find really exciting and tantalizing, and like the power that stories can have, not just on an individual level, but on a cultural level, is like, I'm getting excited just thinking about
So
what that
I
means.
would say people don't go into science fiction half-heartedly. Like, there is a real transformative opportunity that actually occurs in good science fiction. Actually, it also really occurs in bad science fiction as well. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. There is this sense in which we have this opportunity to see the world from a different perspective. Absolutely. Like, when I first watched The Matrix, there are subtlety in there, and it's very easy to get pulled in because there's so much going on. Honestly, there's so much going on in the movie. But immediately you're actually seeing this very effeminate lead male character with a very masculine female lead character, and so you've got all of this I guess enmeshing of sexuality and gender, and then not talking about sexuality and gender at all, but it's just in the environment, it's steeped in the movie. And I think that's where the speculative fiction actually allows us to find ourselves in places where we might not choose to go ordinarily. And that challenges the echo chamber of our worldview. So it's very apocalyptic.
Yeah, I wonder. Like, I'm just thinking out loud. We live in a time of change at a pace that I would suggest is at a quicker pace than has been experienced at a technological level, but also at a cultural level. Do you think that in this, and I guess that also applies to church as well, that the church environment that we live in, COVID probably had a hand in speeding that along. But I think while there is some pull back towards in the other direction, there is this sense that like church is changing. What I guess maybe do you think that this sense, this phrase apocalypse, and this theme of worlds coming to an end to reveal the new, and speculative fiction kind of feeding into that, do you have a sense of that at the moment in from your perspective in the work that you're doing in the communities that you're in, and can speculative fiction and this idea of apocalypse feed into that and maybe help us feel a little bit more comfortable with where we're going? This isn't really a question. My brain's going in this direction, and I want to throw it towards you to see what you think.
I think we were talking about danger and comfort and throwing these words around, but see, we don't grow in comfort. And we grow in danger. We grow in adversity. We need to change something because what we were doing before wasn't working. So the more comfortable we are, the less likely we are to actually be willing to engage in change. So I'm encouraging my community, and I say communities, to really be saying, when you experience discomfort, our immediate response sometimes is defense. It's actually, I've got to protect myself from this. but we can also choose to actually engage in curiosity. So we can actually say, okay, why is this making me uncomfortable? What is it about this that's threatening my worldview? And then begin to discern in that process whether or not the threat is actually something we need to put a boundary up to protect ourselves from and work towards, or whether or not we actually need to engage with this threat because the worldview that it's threatening is one that needs to be critiqued or questioned. So I would say as a Gen X, living through the 80s, trying to be a role player in secret from my parents because the Satanic Panic was saying that we were worshiping Satan in the tent in the backyard, that this idea of apocalypse has been a part of my whole life journey, that I feel like, especially from a religious perspective, the church, and it precedes us because, I mean, if we begin to ask what's threatening the worldview of him, how does imagination, science fiction, role-playing threaten the worldview of the Christian church? What it begins to do is it begins to allow us to ask questions of the empire, and it actually allows us to say, well, what's happening around colonialism, and why has the church actually hitched itself to this idea of empire and colonialism? Why do we have the doctrine of discovery? Why do we have? And so suddenly it breaks open all of these questions. And so that's why speculative fiction became such a significant threat to the church's control and identity in the 80s. It's why rock and roll was such a significant. So each of these apocalyptic revolutions that the church has responded negatively against, it's responding negatively against because it's perceiving a threat to its worldview, and it's going to lose control over the people who are actually able to explore that. And so we've got to ask ourselves the same question rather than engaging in a fight or flight response that makes us just sort of go, no, I can't do it. We've got to actually say, okay, why does this happen, and how do we actually confront the things that the reality is, if you read the Gospels and you look at where we've ended up by becoming a part of colonialism and empire, the two should never have come together, and that there's a sense in which they're actually almost polar opposites. And so there's no question in my mind why the church is threatened by imaginative and speculative thinking.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that speculative fiction has done over the years, and you can trace this back, great example with the early Toho Godzilla stuff coming out of post World War II in Japan through to the Cold War fear stuff with things like Day the Earth Stood Still or Body Snatchers, all these, all the way through. Like, you can literally track it through the history of if we're talking cinema. And so I'm always conscious of the films, the speculative fiction, the books, the stories that we're telling today. And what in 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years are we going to look back and note as those were the things at the time? And for me, there are a couple. There's an interesting one this year in the world of horror, which was we've had 2 films come out in the last 2 months that are explicitly about female bodily autonomy, which clearly is a massive cultural talking point and theological talking point as well in church land. But the other really obvious one that I think we're already cognizant of is the role that the digital revolution and AI is playing in speculative fiction at the moment. Last year we had The Creator was probably one of the more notable ones of recent years. And so I in doing so, I'm always trying to think, what are the conversations that we wished we had 10 years ago, and can we start having them now? And I think speculative fiction is the place where those things are already starting to happen. Yeah.
So it allows us to play with things before we actually hit the danger zone. You look at the sci-fi that came out of the late 80s, 90s. You've got a whole lot of apocalyptic sci-fi. You've got nuclear holocaust. You've got, and so all of these served as a warning to society to say, if we keep going along this proliferation path, and then that's going to happen. And I mean, AI is absolutely fabulous for that, because you kind of go, all right, Skynet comes live in the Terminator series, they immediately assess what the threats are to the future of the globe. They discover that it's humanity that's actually going to be the biggest problem. They actually then discern that the only way to deal with that is to obliterate humanity. So they actually embark on an ethnic cleansing of humanity. And the Matrix, the AI does something entirely different. It actually says, well, we need to control humanity. Now, when I look at the evaluations both those AIs did, I really can't blame them. I mean, when you look at our record on climate and global warming, when you look at our record on war and conflict, when you look at what's happening in Gaza at the moment, you kind of have to say, are we the intellect that is most responsible for actually looking after the place? Or if an AI actually was asked to actually discern what the biggest threat to the planet that we live on is, or the universe that we live in is, they would have to come up with the answer that it's humanity that is the problem, and look for a way to either control or remove humanity from the equation. So those warnings were there for us in the 80s, 90s. And I love also the way in which we can look at the way that interpretations of film can change. Like, so when recently I've been really obsessed by looking at the difference between the way David Lynch actually decided to pull the Dune movie together in 1984, and the things that were important in that and significant. And most people have got hung up on the special effects and whether or not that was good. But I'm looking past it. I'm a Doctor Who fan. I'm happy with the rubber monster, as long as we've got a good story. So I'm not interested in how good the worms looked or all those things. But looking at how Villeneuve actually brought a completely different sociological spin, even beginning with rather than Princess Irulan in the beginning narrative, like David Lynch did and like the book does, he begins with Chani. And so the entire story is now set from the indigenous perspective, and that shifts everything. Like, it changes. So we're actually asking a colonial question rather than actually telling an empire story. And I think that's fascinating. Just that part of it is fascinating, to look at the way the two movies have actually get us to ask different questions.
People watching might have spotted back here somewhere, there's a photo of David Lynch back there.
Very good.
I'm a big Lynchian guy. I guess, are there any other?
My only problem with David Lynch was that Patrick Stewart, who I love because he's captain of the Enterprise, was a terrible, terrible cast for Gurney Halleck. I'm much happier with Josh Brolin. And you look at, I mean, it's once again compare and contrast two characters from two different times, that you wouldn't think they were the same person, and yet you can actually see the root actually that actually informs them both. So yeah,
I'm of the potentially controversial opinion that I don't think David Lynch ever actually read Dune. I don't think it's when you look at David Lynch as a filmmaker and you look at his whole career, it's Dune sticks out as and he speaks about it being like the one film that he just regrets making. Especially when you consider, I love it too. It's such I love it in from a few different perspectives of, like, I love it as just like a weird oddball moment in David Lynch's career. Like, he said no to Return of the Jedi and then does Dune. What's going on? Like, what led to that decision? There's a hilarious video of David Lynch explaining or recounting his meeting with George Lucas, asking him to do Return of the Jedi and just getting a migraine and leaving. And then a year later he does Dune. So it's one of those things where I kind of go, I struggle to hold any of that against David Lynch, because he latches onto the visual stuff that he just loves doing, the weird esoteric stuff, like the Guild Navigator in the 84 Dune is, and the space travel sequence, which is something that Villeneuve doesn't address at all. It cuts and the ship's traveled already. I just like, that's awesome. I love that stuff where it's like, for people that have seen the movie, they know what I'm talking about.
I saw a TikTok I saw a TikTok the other day, and the person was saying, "Don't talk about Dune, don't talk about Dune, don't talk about Dune." And then
Yeah,
the other voice said, "Well, if you go to the party, people are going to want to talk about Dune." And then their voice comes back and says, "Yes, but they don't want to talk about Dune the way I want to talk about Dune." And then the mantra of "Don't talk about Dune" comes in, and I just had to go, "Oh, this is." Calling me out so much. Like I have to be really careful about all of science fiction when I'm in social circumstances, because, as I said, I was that teenager in high school where people would go, look, just don't go and don't mention these things if you go and talk to him, because you're gonna lose your way. So
yeah. There was a couple of years, I would have been 19 or 20 when I first discovered Twin Peaks, because I was a fan of David Lynch, but I'm traditionally I'm more of a movie guy. I struggle to a TV show really has to grab me, and so I was late getting to Twin Peaks, which is a David Lynch property. And for about a couple of years, it was that thing of like, do not bring Twin Peaks up around Jonty because he
hmm
will not shut up. And I
Yep.
kind of look back on that and kind of go, yeah, I probably, chill out. It's you don't have to tell everyone about why Twin Peaks is excellent for, you know, as soon as they bring it up. But like, I think it's good to celebrate when we find stories that really resonate with us.
Mm.
And part of the joy of um, encountering stories is then sharing them with other people. Um, and certainly, Twin Peaks as an example. Twin Peaks isn't for everyone. I'll be the first one to admit. But when you do find someone that it resonates with, sharing it with them
That's
is
right.
just like it's the greatest thing ever. It's the greatest thing ever. Um,
And
I
that's the
mean, you
same.
mentioned Star Trek.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the same with gamers. Like one of the things that I realized that I was doing as I moved around from one placement to another as a minister, I find myself moving around the world in different parts of the country. And so when you do move placements from one place to another, you lose all of your social networks, and
Mm,
you move into a new house and you're starting all over again. And so I found that what I was naturally doing was looking for the board game groups. I'd go to the local board game store, I'd talk to the owner of the store, and I'd say, "Hey, is there anything that's happening?" And he would say yes. And so suddenly I'd make these networks out of those. Largely because I know that some people do that with their churches, but I'm often placed in churches that are actually 20 years older than I am, or 20 years younger than I am now that I'm getting older. And so it's not easy to actually find those networks inside the church. But the gamers aren't dependent on age. I'm still playing board games with people who are actually disparate in age, but there's something about the escapism and the entry and the rule set and the table that we're around that actually allows us to get into relationship with each other without needing any of the other social contract to be able to make that work. And so that's why I've kind of in Tasmania we started the Haven tabletop games, and it's still running in North Launceston, and the Courtyard Cafe in Chatswood, not still running, but certainly around board games, and now here, I run a Thursday board games session from 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon to midnight every Thursday. So, and we get between 20 and 50 people come along and participate in the tables of board games. That's led us to form a MegaCon, which is coming up for the second time this year as a board games convention, that's actually really excited about engaging with the spirituality of this of speculative fiction when it comes to. So my thinking about speculative fiction is not restricted to the books I read or the movies I see, but also the games I play. So
mm,
because I guess I'm probably a bit snobbish there as I go, actually there's planes of existence. It's kind of like,
mm.
watch a movie, read a book, play a game.
Yeah.
And if you can play a game, then you've transcended into the highest plane of pondering.
Mm. Definitely. I mean, going full circle all the way back to Apocalypse. Probably one of, if not the formative, transformative experiences with story I had during COVID, um, was discovering The Last of Us on
hmm
PlayStation, and having I was very late to gaming, and this is console gaming, obviously, as opposed to tabletop gaming, but suddenly having that experience of, I can read all the books I want, I can see all the films that I want, and I do, but like actually stepping into the story and claiming agency with one of the characters or some of the characters. I just it arrived at the perfect time in my life because I couldn't leave my house, and I wasn't sleeping, so I was Ellie in The Last of Us for a couple of months, and it was just literally a transformative experience. Yeah.
Computer games let us do something really fascinating too. They actually allow us, many of them, to save our game before we make a choice, so that if we don't like the choice we've made, we can go back to our last save and make a different choice. Or maybe we're not going to be as, I don't know what the word is. There's something unethical about that, but I do it. But also we can replay. So even if you didn't save and go back, if you played it again, you would go, okay, next time I want to see what happens if I do this, and you end up with these sliding doors moments. There's another great movie. Where you actually can go, well, I'm going to make a choice here, and it's going to take me in a completely different direction, and so it actually allows us to ask that question: what are the consequences of the different choices? What universes are created when I make each choice in my life? And rather than that being a regretful, backward-looking thing, we can also project that and actually say, well, okay, let me workshop this. What are the potential outcomes that could happen by making a particular choice, which is not the same as saving a game and making a different choice, but allowing you to be able to go, well, here are the paths that lie before me, rather than thinking I have no agency or control.
Yeah. There are so many other things I want to talk to you about. I think if you're down, I'd love to do this again and talk about AI and where that intersects with faith. I think that for me, certainly at the moment, is one of the really, really prominent things that I'm thinking a lot about, and what place does spirituality and faith hold in a world with AI almost at its center already. So I'll dangle that in front of our listeners as a little carrot for a future episode, hopefully. But where can people find you if they want to tune into Odd Sonder? Maybe hit us with the details for that again, and yeah, just hit us with all the details.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, some of the listeners will be familiar with Twitch as a platform, but you can just Google Twitch and it comes up, and then you can search for Sonderverse Community, and you'll actually find that there. There is a link for it, but I don't have it in front of me at the moment. But if you search for Twitch, usually I find it's better to tell people, because they can't write the link down anyway, so I could list off where it is. If you're looking for my speculative fiction stuff, then that's really easy to find. That's at oddrev.com. And I'm kind of blogging and doing bits and pieces there, putting up bits of games that I've played. And also you can find me at Neveroddoreven on YouTube, or even better, if you'd love to come and engage with the faith and fiction conversation, then Neveroddoreven on wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I picked Neveroddoreven because it's a palindrome. It's the same forward as it is backwards.
Nice.
Thanks to Weird Al Yankovic for giving me that one. But I love that it's for me, that's how Apocalypse is as well. There's this end and beginning that's actually forwards and backwards, and it's really fascinating how that evolved. So never odd or even in the middle of it, actually, where in the logo that was made for me by an artist in Tasmania named Ben Winwood. Thanks, Ben, for the logo. In the middle of that, it actually has these two dice that have not come to rest yet, and they make up the O and the D kind of thing in there. And so it actually comes out as Odd Rev, and that's where I got the title Odd Rev from, in the middle of Neveroddoreven. And so most of my stuff online is either under Odd Rev or Neveroddoreven. And so you can look that up on Spotify or wherever it is that you're listening to. There's so about half of Deep Space Nine, which is some of the most amazing spiritual science fiction that has been produced in the Star Trek universe. I'd love to do a podcast on Babylon 5, which actually sits in the same era. And also we're about 5 seasons through Voyager, at the moment, and particularly loving looking at Voyager from a faith and fiction perspective, because you've got a community of people in exile, far away from home, trying to work out how to sing the Federation's song in a strange land. So there's some really deeply resonating stuff there about looking at some Old Testament study, but also looking at us as a community today in the midst of our apocalypse, where we actually feel that we might be quite disconnected from the literature that actually informs our faith. So they're having to constantly work through that. So yeah, that's where you can find me. If you wanna get into it straight away, or you want to find us straight up, and then going to Sonderverse on Twitch is something you can do next Monday night at 8 o'clock. All you need to do is follow the link, do the search. But we would love it if you would actually just take that next step of just filling in, an email address and a couple of other bits and pieces with Twitch, come up with your own handle, let us know. And if you've done that, then come along on Monday and say, hey, we're interested in, I heard about you from Filthy Hope, and we'll welcome you along. So yeah, love to have you come and be there. It was great to have you on the other week. We've had you and Will Small from Spiritual Misfits as well. And so we're looking at getting a whole range of different guests from a broad range of theology to be able to work through and deconstruct and speculate. There's a whole other area we could have talked about Christian fan fiction. Fan fiction is that space where people actually fill in the gaps, where the story doesn't provide us enough information, and the Bible actually has left rich areas for Christian fan fiction, where we actually have massive gaps. And some people will go, oh, I can't do the Bible because it's inconsistent and there are gaps. But I'll go, actually, no, that provides us with an opportunity to be able to write or read or storytell into those gaps and actually come up with our own stuff, and explore it from a different perspective.
That sounds, yeah. I mean, let's pencil in episode part 2 immediately, because we've got so much more to talk about. And we'll have to get Rev Ness onto Odd Thunder as well, because I think that'd be
keen to
be
do
a ball
that.
of fun. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
So
I absolutely love hearing Rev Ness on Filthy Hope. And I usually listen to it in the car, and so I'm finding myself talking back and having conversations, and so yeah, that we're looking forward to having Rev Ness on Odd Sonder. Love to actually have an opportunity to engage with Ness about some of this stuff as well, because I listening to your recent podcast about the Last Temptation of Christ, and hearing the apocalypse that Rev Ness was going through by watching that film, that's exactly what we're talking about here. We're actually saying that there's the opportunity to be able to go, well, what if Jesus didn't go to the cross? And immediately if we ask that question, we say that's an unthinkable question. We shouldn't be asking that question. And yet this movie actually allows us an entry point to be able to go, okay, we can work that through. So
yeah, 100%. That we'll make all of these things happen. I'm very excited to facilitate that and be a part of that in whatever form those conversations take. So as always as well, if you have any further questions for Will, hit him up in any of those places. But if you want to reach out to us, filthyhopepod@gmail.com. And if there's anything coming through there for Will, we'll pass it through, and I'm sure we'll address it on a future episode. Any final thoughts? Actually, I was going to ask before we wrap up, were there any, you mentioned Dune was a recent film release. Were there any other recent sci-fi or speculative fiction movie, book, game, whatever it is, that you're particularly enjoying that you want to recommend to our listeners as a final thought?
Last movie I saw was Ghostbusters, and absolutely found that there was some great fan service, gave me a really good nostalgic trip back. I've rewatched the last couple of Ghostbusters just to kind of get myself in the mood. But there was this, I really loved that I could actually journey into something that was from my childhood. I was one of those kids with the Ghostbusters t-shirts on. and so I wrote, and it coincided with Easter time. So I just wrote a blog entry about Ghostbusters and Jesus, and wrote a piece of speculative fiction about the Ghostbusters being called to the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. So that's on my Odd Rev blog. You can check that out. So I loved being able to engage with that and actually see how inside that, especially for the church, what we've got is an intergenerational process actually taking place where we've got these old guys who did this back in the day, having to come to terms with the way that the new guys are actually engaging with it. So there's some really interesting stuff around intergenerational there. Yeah, so look, also loving Chidi Gatwa coming out in the new Doctor Who, watching all of that, and the bi-generation of David Tennant as Doctor Who now being 14 as well as 10. So there's lots of really good stuff. And the other one I would want to mention is I've just finished watching the series 12 Monkeys.
Yes, isn't it great?
And it is incredible. I actually think that along with Timeless, which is also really good, there are very few places where this idea that things begin where they end, it happens to come place. But time travel science fiction, when it's done really well, actually begins and ends in the same place, and gives us a real strong, large, big picture kind of look at what apocalypse is all about, in terms of both occupying the space of the end of worldview and the beginning of worldview. Yeah, I don't know where you can watch 12 Monkeys now, because I got a message when I was just finishing it the other day to say that 7+ was taking it off, but I think it's probably available on Apple. But I highly recommend it. And look, that's a whole other area. The whole area of time travel and paradox is something that I'm just absolutely fascinated with too. So, I could talk for another hour on that as well. So,
yeah. On the time travel thing, there's if I were to make one recommendation to close off as well, I recently have rewatched. I don't know if you've heard of this film Primer, Shane Carruth's Primer. It was made on about $5,000, and it's for the uninitiated in science fiction, is borderline unwatchable, because it's these two essentially businessmen and inventors who unwittingly create a time machine and then suddenly realize what they've done, and so try to use it to jump ahead and invest wisely and make money. And it follows what you think initially are the two original of these two men, and it takes over 80 minutes. It's one of the most complex, but if you sit down and really spend time with it, it's almost one of those what if time travel were real, in a really scientific grounded way. I would highly recommend people go check that out. There's a new Blu-ray about to come out, which is why I was just revisiting it.
I've made a note. I'm going to look for that, find that out. So
yeah, great. Yeah. It's for sci-fi nerds. It's the best thing ever. Yeah.
Yep. Look, I love Tenet as well. I don't know. Did you see Tenet? The one that
I did see Tenet.
It's an amazingly crafted story, and thinking about the way that it actually deals with time and time travel as well is really fascinating. So yeah, we could go on and on.
I think there's about 2 or 3 episodes that we're going to do now. So
yeah.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We will see you next time.
So is this the end of the podcast, or is it the beginning? Like, this could be it could be the beginning or the end.
If you're listening on Spotify, if you hit the repeat button, then it can be both.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because it ends now, but then it could begin again in just a couple of minutes' time, and you might discover something entirely new. There might be, it may not end the same way as it did last time.
So there we have it. That was my issue with Odd Rev. As we sort of briefly talked about in that conversation, there are heaps and heaps of other ways that you can get in touch from and participate in all the stuff that Odd Rev is doing. Links for all of which will be down below. In particular, I want you to go check out Neveroddoreven on your podcast platform of choice, or go check out their live streams that they do on Twitch every Monday evening at 8 p.m. Go check that out as well. And if you have any questions for me or for Will, please do get in touch. filthyhopepod@gmail.com or find us on socials. All the links for all of that stuff will be down below. The only other thing I want to give you a shout out for to keep you in the know is that our first live event of the year will be at Turramurra Uniting Church on the 30th of June, which is a Sunday evening at 6 p.m. We are currently putting together our list of guests. It's looking very exciting. Once I know all of the guests that are locked in for us, I will let you all know. So keep your eyes peeled on socials or here on the podcast. We will let you know as soon as possible. And as soon as links to reserve a spot are available, they'll be right here in the show notes. Or if you want to keep checking for those, join our Facebook group, which is linked down below, or shoot us an email at filthyhopepod@gmail.com. All of the details for that will also be on all of our social media. So if you want to go check out all of that and see what is happening, go over there and you'll find everything you need to know. That just about does us. We will talk to you next time for another episode of Filthy Hope.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation undeserved.